Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Seminar K of the Monique and Roland Weil People's Academy of International Law. I am Marjorie Cohn, Dean of the People's Academy and a member of the Bureau of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, or IADL. Today, we will discuss using international law to analyze racism, apartheid, Zionism, and anti-Semitism. Our distinguished faculty for this seminar includes Chief Charles Taku, Lennox Hines, Emea Gelman, and Carolyn Carchet. Each of them will speak for 20 minutes, followed by a discussion between the faculty members and then Q&A with all of you. We have Spanish, French, and English translation. You can select your language at the bottom of your screen. Please put your questions in the Q&A box for our discussion. We will soon post on our website, peoplesacademy.net, the faculty presentations in English, Spanish, and French, along with links to relevant articles and the texts of their remarks. You will receive an email when the program is posted. Almost 3 years ago, Israel launched the first live-streamed genocide in history, killing at least 75,000 people and likely many more in Gaza. Nearly all of Gaza's current population of 2.1 million people has been displaced, lacking access to sufficient shelter, food, life-saving medical services, clean water, education, and livelihoods. On January 26, 2024, the International Court of Justice determined that Israel was plausibly committing genocide in Gaza. Israel is now using its same genocidal playbook in Lebanon. It has pummeled southern Lebanon and displaced 1.2 million people, 1/5 of the Lebanese population. Since March 2nd, Israel has killed more than 4,106 people in Lebanon. Israel has long maintained a system of apartheid. Israel subjects Palestinians to arbitrary arrests, expropriates their property, maintains separate areas and roads, segregated housing, different legal and educational systems for Palestinians and Jews, and prevents mixed marriages. Only Jews, not Palestinians, are allowed to return to Israel-Palestine, in spite of international laws guaranteeing the Palestinians' right of return. Israel is a Zionist regime. In order to grasp Israel's motivation for conducting genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, it is necessary to understand the important and separate but related concepts of racism, apartheid, Zionism, and anti-Semitism. The International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination defines racial discrimination as any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. The Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid classifies apartheid as a crime against humanity. It defines apartheid as inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. The Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court codifies apartheid crimes as certain inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. In 1975, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution determining that Zionism was a form of racism. But 16 years later, in response to US and Israeli denunciations of the resolution as anti-Semitic, the General Assembly repealed it. Today, anti-Zionism is conflated with anti-Semitism, which has led to repression of pro-Palestinian voices throughout the US and elsewhere. On June 9th, in an important victory for free speech, a US district court dismissed with prejudice all civil rights conspiracy claims brought against the People's Forum and other individual defendants arising from the April 2024 occupation of Hamilton Hall at Columbia University in New York. The ruling is a vindication of the right to engage in political speech condemning US-backed Israeli war crimes and genocide, and to call for support of encamped student activists demanding divestment. This seminar will examine racism, apartheid, Zionism, and anti-Semitism in international law, particularly in the current context of Palestine. Faculty will trace the struggle against apartheid, the history of Zionism, and the current conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism with disastrous consequences. Our first faculty member is Lennox S. Hines. He is Professor Emeritus of Law and former chair of the Administration of Justice program at Rutgers University. He was awarded the law school's J. Skelly Wright Award for contribution to civil rights, and he was a Charles H. Rayson Fellow at the Center for Legal Education and Urban Policy at City College of New York. He was awarded CCNY's highest Townsend Harris Medal for outstanding postgraduate achievement in his chosen field. Professor Hines was Nelson Mandela's U.S. Attorney and counsel to the government of South Africa, the African National Congress, ANC, of South Africa, and SWAPO of Namibia. He is the permanent representative to the United Nations for the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, IADL, of which he is a former vice president. He served for many years as national director of the National Conference of Black Lawyers of the US and Canada. He has traveled, written, and lectured extensively in Africa, Europe, Asia, and North America on international human rights issues and on the impact of racism on the operation of the law, particularly the criminal justice systems of the US. He has published and taught about crimes against humanity under international law for more than 2 decades and has presented expert testimony on the crimes against humanity of the apartheid regime before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Johannesburg, South Africa, presided over by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. In 1998, Professor Hines was appointed by the UN as lead counsel to represent the interest of defendants accused by the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda of genocide, crimes against humanity, and other serious violations of international law. He is a member of the task force of the People's Academy of International Law. Professor Hines will discuss apartheid, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Professor Hines, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you, Madam Chairperson and members of the symposium. On behalf of the Association of Democratic Lawyers, I'm pleased to have been afforded the opportunity to share with you excerpts from our contribution to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa that we presented in 1997. The full text that I presented in 1997 is available for your consideration. As I understand it, it will be on the tribunal's website. In 1991, as a lawyer for the ANC, myself and my then law partner, Richard Harvey, were invited to attend the ANC Congress in Durban, South Africa, and that was after the ANC was unbanned. At that Congress, Dara Omar, the ANC Minister of Justice, requested that I make a formal presentation before the TRC, arguing that apartheid is a crime against humanity under international law. The IADL organization was formed about 51 years ago. That was 51 years from 1997 in Paris at an international gathering of lawyers who had fought and survived the wars against fascism and participated in the Nuremberg trials. We are a non-governmental organization with consultative status at ECOSOC, UNESCO, and UNICEF. In 1988, we sponsored legal missions to observe the implementation of United Nations Security Council Resolution 435 in Namibia's electoral transition to independence. And in March of 1994, we organized international legal observer missions to the elections in South Africa. Now, my presentation, Madam Chair, will deal with the gross violations of human rights of the apartheid regime under international law. By way of preliminary statement, when I was preparing the submission for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, documenting the gross violations of human rights committed by the apartheid regime, I had occasion to read Mr. E.W. de Klerk's August 21st, 1996 statement and the subsequent March 23rd, 1997 submission to the TRC on behalf of the National Party, setting out the National Party's view of the historical context within which the conflicts of the past should be considered. I was shocked and dismayed to read his efforts to attempt to debase the cumulative and collective resolve of the vast majority of nations of the world from every continent meeting at the United Nations, which determined that the way in which the South African regime implements the policy of apartheid should be henceforth considered a kind of genocide. In this submission, Madam Chair, we will attempt to examine the crimes against humanity deliberately inflicted on the people of South Africa by the apartheid regime, both before and after 1960. And we will define these criminal acts in the context of the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid and its antecedents. The Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which were both unanimously adopted by the General Assembly of the UN in December of 1948. A fundamental assumption of this submission, Madam Chair, is that these acts of apartheid, of the apartheid regime, constituted a continuing crime against humanity throughout the time periods discussed. I am honored to be given an opportunity to present these views on behalf of thousands of members, lawyers, and jurors of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers in over 19 nation states throughout the world. Despite their different economic, political, and social systems, they're all united in their dedication to the principles of the United Nations Charter. As a preliminary note, Madam Chair, we note that although one of the specific terms of reference of the TRC in these hearings is the rule of the legal system during the apartheid period between 1960 and 1994, it is another contention of this submission that any analysis of apartheid as a crime against humanity must be examined in the respect of the genesis, that is, the conquest, the pillage, and the theft of lands from the peoples who inhabited them, which became the Republic of South Africa. It should be noted while the struggle in South Africa was certainly about racism, it also was a byproduct of and a repudiation of colonialism, which permitted the white minorities control of South Africa and the maintenance of the power required to keep that control. It was this kind of group-based oppression that the General Assembly addressed in 1960 when it adopted Resolution 1514 on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples. Recognizing the passionate yearning for freedom in all dependent peoples in the attainment of their independence and believing that the process of liberation is irreversible and irresistible, and that in order to avoid serious crisis, an end must be put to colonialism and all practices of segregation and discrimination associated with it. This submission, Madam Chair, will also briefly consider the colonial racist history as well as the codified apartheid laws of South Africa in support of its assertion that all peoples of color of South Africa, whether they be defined by the racist law as African, or defined as Indians, or defined as coloreds, were the victims of gross human rights violation under the peremptory norms of jus cogens of international law. These laws not only sanction the gross and pervasive violation of individual human rights, which are the subject of the TRC's commissions and mandates, this submission provides, but also the catalyst for the legally permissible torture and murder and other abuses of power undertaken by law enforcement officers and other representatives of the apartheid government about which the CRC has taken such grisly testimony. Let me just briefly comment on the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. That convention was unanimously adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on December 9th of 1948 in Paris, one day before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is singularly appropriate that today in South Africa we examine apartheid in the context of these legal manifestations of the collective will of the nations of the world as the 50th anniversary of the adoption of both the Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration on Human Rights is being planned. Genocide is a new form for an old crime. It means the deliberate destruction of national, racial, religious, or ethnic groups. It has been practiced through recorded history. The systematic annihilations of millions in the 20th century because of their religious or ethnic origin so shocked the world that it collectively rejected the traditional contention that such crimes were the exclusive concern of the state that perpetrated them under domestic law, adopted for the purpose of the destruction of the groups deemed inferior. If we look at Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, it sets forth, Madam Chair, the acts which constitute such a crime, and whether or not committed in the time of war or in the time of peace. It includes the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part any national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups. A. The killing members of the group. B. Causing serious bodily mental harm to members of the group. C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction in whole or in part. D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. E. Forcibly transmitting children of the group to another group. Genocide today, Madam Chair, is recognized by the world community as an international crime under customary international law, even when committed in territories of states that are not parties to the convention. Now, looking at apartheid in relation to the Genocide Convention, Madam Chair, apartheid was examined in relation to the Genocide Convention by an ad hoc working group of experts established by Resolution 2.28 of the Commission on Human Rights. They produced a study concerning the questions of apartheid from the point of view of international penal law. The following practices, Madam Chair, under the laws of apartheid were identified as instances of genocide. A. The institution of group areas Bantustan policies which affected the African population by banning them to areas which were totally lacking the preconditions of their traditional professions. The regulations of or concerning the movement of Africans to urban areas, and especially the forcible separation of Africans from their wives during long periods, thereby preventing African births. The policies in general, which were said to include deliberate malnutrition of large population sectors and birth controls of the non-white sectors in order to reduce their numbers, while it had an official policy to favor white immigration. C, the imprisonment and ill treatment of non-white political group leaders, of non-white prisoners in general. D, the killing of non-white population through a system of slave or tied labor, especially in so-called transit camps. Of November 3rd, 1973, the General Assembly adopted the International Crime of Apartheid. They relied upon the Charter of the United Nations, in which all members pledged to work together to achieve universal respect for and observations of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction to race, sex, language, or religion. Apartheid constituted a crime under international law. The situation in South Africa, arising out of the official state policy of apartheid, establishing two parallel systems of law and government, one for the minority and one for the majority, discussed later on in this submission, was addressed by the world community more than any other international matter because not only the 1973 Convention on Apartheid, customary international law, and treaty law defined apartheid as a crime under international law, another confirmation of its designation of a crime against humanity, Madam Chair, can be seen in the Geneva Conference on Humanitarian Law, which, in addition to Protocol 1 of 1977, adopted it to the Geneva Convention of 19 and the following. Apartheid and other human degrading practices involving outrages upon personal dignity based on racial discrimination, shall be regarded as grave breaches of the protocol when committed willfully and in violation of the convention and its protocol. Similarly, Madam Chair, the International Law Commission defined the international crime as a wrongful act which resulted from the breach of the state of an international obligation so essential for the protection of fundamental interests of the international community that its breach is recognized as a crime by that community as an international crime. Thereafter, the Commission adopted Article 19, which states that an international crime may result, among other examples, from a serious breach on a widespread scale of an international obligation of essential importance of safeguarding the human being, such as prohibited in slavery, genocide, and apartheid. Madam Chair, I will now briefly highlight what I have discussed in our submission concerning the gross violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For example, the imposition of the criminal law and criminal procedure as methods of political control to implement apartheid policy in violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, specifically violations of Article 5, Article 6, Article 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 18, 19, 20, subsection 121, subsection 1 and 21, subsection 2 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The economic exploitation that is legally authorized, repression of trade unions under apartheid, violated Article 4, Articles 23, subsection 1, Articles 24, and Articles 25 on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Bantustan policy violated, more specifically, Article 15, subsection 1, Article 16, subsection 1, Article 17, subsection 1, Article 25, subsection 1, and Article 26, subsection 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The legal denial of the right to medical and education under apartheid violated Article 25 and Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The legal denial of the right of access to public accommodation and cultural life violated Articles 27 and Article 7 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The denial of the right to international travel, which specifically violated Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Denial of the press rights and free exchange of information, which many members of the media were here experienced, violated Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 1983 South African Constitution, which we contend was a political ruse, was a continuing violation of Article R21. I would like to end by paraphrasing from Ezekiel 18, verse 2, and Isaiah 31, verse 29 of the Old Testament, which says, a legacy of the sour grapes of the forebears, which continue to set their teeth on edge, is in fact the legacy that has been left by the apartheid regime. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Professor Hines, for your critical testimony before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for detailing the relationship between genocide and apartheid, and for your contribution to getting apartheid adopted as a crime against humanity under international law. Our next faculty member is Carolyn Karcher. Carolyn L. Karcher is Professor Emerita of English, American Studies, and Women's Studies at Temple University. and the author of many books and articles about the struggle for racial and gender equality in the United States. Her most recent book is Reclaiming Judaism from Zionism, a Moral Imperative After the Gaza Genocide, which is a collection of personal narratives in which 47 Jews of diverse backgrounds, including myself, describe the roads they have traveled from a Zionist worldview to activism in solidarity with Palestinians and Israelis striving to build an inclusive society founded on justice, equality, and peaceful coexistence. Professor Karcher will discuss Judaism, Zionism, and anti-Semitism, definitions and distinctions. Professor Karcher, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marjorie. I feel a little intimidated after Lennox's presentation because I have no background in international law, but I will do the best I can without such background. The topics of Zionism and anti-Semitism have been intentionally muddied by the pro-Israel lobby. Here are two examples. One, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, has not only created a definition of anti-Semitism that equates it with criticism of Israel, but has labored hard and successfully to persuade nations and public institutions to adopt this definition as a means of outlawing criticism of Israel. Two, the Anti-Defamation League has insisted that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. To counteract the pro-Israel lobby's propaganda, we must begin by distinguishing Zionism from Judaism. Judaism is a religion centering around a body of sacred texts, ritual practices, and ethical precepts that have evolved over several thousand years from a temple-based tribal religion to a scripture-based portable religion with universalist claims, created by rabbis after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 CE. Zionism is a century-and-a-half-year-old political ideology of Jewish nationalism that originated in the 1880s with Russian Jews who were enduring pogroms at the hands of state-sanctioned anti-Semitic mobs. Zionism gained traction only after being embraced by the Viennese Jew Theodor Herzl, who founded the World Zionist Congress in 1897, a year after publishing his pamphlet, The Jewish State. Zionist ideology maintains that anti-Semitism will arise wherever Jews live as minorities, and that they can escape it only by founding a state of their own, which they dominate and control as a majority. Herzl initially considered Argentina and Uganda as possible sites for the Jewish state, a fact that clearly identifies Zionism as a settler colonial ideology. He ultimately decided on Palestine, the site favored by Russian Jews, because it would appeal more to the Jewish masses he hoped to recruit as laborers. Herzl openly described the Jewish state he had in mind as a colonial project when he sought to win backing for it from colonial leaders. The Jewish state in Palestine would, quote, form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism, end quote. He wrote in his 1896 pamphlet. When colonialism fell out of favor, Zionists instead characterized their ideology as one of self-determination for Jews. They also sought to legitimate Zionism by anchoring it in biblical texts, which they reinterpreted to fit their ideology. After the creation of Israel in 1948, and especially after the 1967 war, Zionists won control of almost all Jewish institutions, including synagogues, schools, and summer camps. In the process, they redefined Judaism and Jewish identity as centering around Israel, which had not been the case since the year 70 CE. It is this redefinition that has enabled Zionists to equate criticism of Israel and of their ideology with anti-Semitism. Nothing better refutes the charge that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism than the long history of Jewish anti-Zionism. When Herzl launched his call for a Jewish state as the solution to anti-Semitism, Jews overwhelmingly rejected the proposition as a dangerous heresy. German rabbis objected so strenuously to his holding the first World Zionist Congress in Munich that Herzl had to move its venue to Basel, Switzerland. Rabbis representing the entire spectrum of Jewish theology denounced the Zionist ideology of Jewish nationalism on both religious and political grounds. Religiously, Orthodox rabbis accused Zionists of violating the divine injunction against seeking to acquire the Holy Land by human effort, and of usurping the role of the Messiah, whose coming was supposed to redeem the Jewish people from spiritual exile and usher in the universal reign of peace, justice, and righteousness. At the other end of the spectrum, US Reform rabbis totally disapproved of the attempt to establish a Jewish state. Indeed, Reform Judaism's Pittsburgh Platform of 1885 had already specified, quote, "We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state," end quote. Politically, both Orthodox and Reform rabbis feared that by calling on Jews to emigrate to Palestine, Zionism would impugn their patriotism and imperil their status as loyal citizens of the countries in which they resided. Jews also formed organizations specifically dedicated to fighting Zionism. One such organization was the American Council for Judaism, founded in 1942 and headed by the Reform rabbi Elmer Berger, who spent much of his later life working with Palestinians and other Arabs. The council lobbied US government officials, testified at the UN against creating a Jewish state in Palestine or anywhere else, and sought to influence US public opinion through lectures and widely disseminated articles. As an alternative to a Jewish state, the council advocated a more generous immigration policy that would enable Jews to take refuge in the US from the lethal anti-Semitism that threatened them in Europe. The council kept up its battle against Zionism even after the founding of Israel, and only ceased operations after Israel's triumphal victory in the Six-Day War of 1967. It has recently been revived by Reform Rabbi Andrew Kahn. While the American Council for Judaism represented prosperous Jews of German descent, the Jewish Labor Bund, a militantly secular socialist organization, represented working-class Russian and Polish Jews. Founded in Vilna, Lithuania, then part of the Russian Pale, in 1897, the same year as the World Zionist Congress, the Bund boasted more than 30,000 members in Tsarist Russia. Transplanted in Poland after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Bund there claimed 100,000 members at its peak. It articulated an ideology of Jewish liberation diametrically opposed to Zionism. Quote, "The needs and aspirations of the Jewish people can be satisfied only by means of a struggle waged by them in the countries where they now live and carried on together with the peoples of those countries," end quote. Bundists called this principle of local joint struggle Doigkeit, a Yiddish word meaning here-ness. They viewed socialism as the ultimate solution to anti-Semitism. Although the vast majority of the Bund's Polish members perished in the Holocaust, those who survived did not renounce their opposition to Zionism. When Zionist emissaries in the displaced persons camps sought to force surviving Bundes to emigrate to Palestine, they resisted, protesting in a memorandum to the UN that Jewish DPs should be enabled to settle wherever they chose to. The Bund, too, has recently been revived. True, neither the Bund nor the American Council for Judaism managed to prevent the creation of Israel. The reasons are many. First and foremost, the Holocaust. Second, and almost equally important, the refusal of the US and European democracies to accept Jewish Holocaust survivors as immigrants. Third, the Cold War, which led the Soviet Union and the world's communist parties to support the creation of Israel in the hope that it would serve them as an ally. Fourth, anti-communism, which led anti-Zionist Jews to subordinate their cause to the perceived priority of combating communism. Last but not least, both the American Council for Judaism and the Bund lacked any contact with Palestinians. Hence, they opposed Zionism, not because they realized what a deleterious impact the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine would have on the native population, but because they believed Zionism would be bad for the Jews. The euphoria aroused by the founding of Israel and its triumph in the Six-Day War seemed to indicate otherwise. But now, in the light of Israel's genocide in Gaza and the rise of anti-Semitism it has provoked, we can see that these anti-Zionist Jewish organizations were right. Zionism has indeed proved bad for the Jews. Despite the eclipse of Jewish anti-Zionist organizations after 1967, dissent never completely died out. And as Israel's addiction to warfare and its brutal treatment of Palestinians gradually became more visible to American Jews, new Jewish organizations arose to demand peace, justice, and reconciliation of the two peoples. The largest and most successful of these organizations has been Jewish Voice for Peace. Founded in 1996 by women students at the University of California, Berkeley, JVP metamorphosed in 2006 from a small Bay Area group that met in members' living rooms to a national organization that now numbers 32,000 active dues-paying members and hundreds of thousands of online supporters. Politically, JVP has evolved from promoting cooperation between Zionist and anti-Zionist members in fighting against the Israeli occupation to officially identifying itself as anti-Zionist. It did so in 2019 after polling its members. JVP now denounces Zionism as, quote, a false and failed solution to the murderous anti-Semitism, quote, Jews confronted in Europe, and as an ideology irreconcilable with JVP's vision of justice, equality, and freedom for all peoples. Unlike the Bund and the American Council for Judaism, JVP works closely with Palestinians, both here and in Palestine. To implement its vision of justice, equality, and freedom for all people, JVP also participates in a broad progressive coalition that links the Palestinian cause with those of other oppressed groups: African Americans, immigrants, Native Americans, Muslims, LGBTQ communities, and the victims of US wars, much as the Bund envisaged, but with greater expansiveness. Formerly, all of these groups had pursued their goals in separate silos on the assumption that the others competed with them for attention. All had likewise viewed the Palestinian cause as so controversial that it had to be excluded from mention lest it imperil their own. But the Gaza genocide has awakened everyone to a different reality. All oppressed groups now recognize Palestinian oppression as embodying key features of the persecution they themselves endure. Palestinian liberation as encompassing everyone's liberation, and a unified intersectional movement is stronger than one limited to a single group or issue. This recognition has greatly strengthened JVP. Among JVP's tactics have been bold civil disobedience actions at iconic sites such as the Statue of Liberty and the New York Stock Exchange, campaigns for divestment, such as from Israel bonds, supporting pro-Palestinian electoral candidates, such as Zohran Mamdani, and lobbying Congress for ending military aid to Israel. These activities have not only gained JVP wide attention and media coverage, but have helped change public discourse. As Mamdani's victory showed, criticizing Israel no longer ruins a politician's career. A majority of Democratic senators have signed on to the Block the Bombs bill, calling for stopping lethal military aid to Israel. Both of these developments would have been unthinkable less than 5 years ago. In some of these activities, JVP has been joined by If Not Now, an organization of young Jews founded in protest against Israel's 2014 war on Gaza and the Jewish establishment's backing of that war. If Not Now members typically attend Jewish day schools that indoctrinate them in Zionism, and they experience a sense of betrayal when they learn the facts that have been omitted from their education, such as Israel's expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians to make room for Jewish immigrants in 1948. Initially more insular than JVP, in keeping with their focus on changing Jewish institutions and recruiting members from within them, they too have evolved toward coalition building and in many cases toward anti-Zionism as individuals, though not yet as an organization. For decades, Zionists systematically effaced the history of Jewish anti-Zionism. This allowed them to smear their opponents as anti-Semites by simply ignoring the large numbers of Jews in anti-Zionist ranks. Among those ignored have been highly visible ultra-Orthodox Jews who participate in all demonstrations, carrying signs that say, Zionism is not Judaism, and authentic Judaism rejects the state of Israel. Over the past few years, however, anti-Zionist Jews have become so prominent in demonstrations against Israel's genocide in Gaza and in support for politicians who criticize Israel that the mainstream press can no longer pretend they don't exist. Even when quoting Zionist leaders' complaints about their opponents' alleged anti-Semitism, journalists now routinely acknowledge that these opponents include many anti-Zionist Jews. Journalists have even started to quote JVP and, if not now, leaders and spokespersons whom they once used to cold shoulder. In part, this change has come about because Israel has dropped all pretenses since starting the genocide in October 2023. Concomitantly, Americans no longer rely on the mainstream media for their news. Thus, Israel's refusal to allow mainstream international journalists into Gaza did not cut off news of the war as intended. Instead, Palestinian journalists stepped into the breach and live streamed the genocide to everyone who owned a cell phone. Israel has assassinated well over 250 of these brave Palestinian journalists, but it has not regained control over the narrative that it used to monopolize. Meanwhile, in response to this live stream genocide and to the chasm between what they saw on their phone screens and what they were taught in their synagogues and Jewish day schools, young Jews have been turning against Zionism in droves. According to the latest polls, 63% of Jews no longer consider themselves Zionists. Young Jews have not necessarily been turning against Judaism, however. During the encampments on college campuses, many of the Jewish students held Shabbat and Passover services to which they invited their non-Jewish comrades. They reported that these services were better attended than the ones offered by the campus Hillels that smeared the encampments as anti-Semitic. Accordingly, JVP has embraced a religious mission, building a Judaism beyond Zionism, along with its political mission of shifting public discourse and stopping U.S. military aid to Israel. This entails emphasizing Judaism's ethical precepts and removing the encrusted Zionist interpretations that have turned a religion into a political ideology of Jewish supremacism. JVP has been carrying out this mission by helping to provide new spiritual homes for its members in anti and non-Zionist synagogues and informal prayer groups. In sum, we've come full circle. I began by distinguishing between Judaism and Zionism, and I've ended by describing JVP's endeavor to reclaim Judaism from Zionism. I hope it is now clear that it is not anti-Semitic to reject Zionism. On the contrary, rejecting Zionism is being true to the best teachings of Judaism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Karsher, for explaining the distinction between Judaism and Zionism and the history of Zionism in Israel, Palestine, including the historical opposition to Zionism and a Jewish state by many Jews, and the Bund and today's Jewish Voice for Peace. Our next faculty member is Amaya Gelman. She is the author of The Anti-Defamation League and the Racial State, a critical history of the Anti-Defamation League as a Cold War neoconservative institution, published by UC Press in 2026, and co-editor of the Anti-Defamation League, a critical reader, published by Pluto Press in 2026. She hosts the podcast Unpacking Zionism. Ms. Gelman is co-chair of the American Studies Association Caucus on Academic and Community Activism and a longtime activist in New York City. She is the founding director of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, which examines the political and ideological work of Zionist institutions in Palestine and transnational contexts. She researches the history of ideas about race, queerness, safety, and rights, and their production as levers in surveillance, so-called anti-terror, and war. Her teaching spans academic and community spaces. Ms. Gelman will discuss anti-Semitism statistics and the neoconservative project. Ms. Gelman, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's good to be with you today. I am going to speak about a topic that is related to what Dr. Karsher was speaking about, which is the question of why the feelings and safety and centrality of Jewish protection is always seeming to be brought to the center of our conversations about genocide and apartheid being perpetrated against Palestinians and against people in the Swana region. The center of this project of placing anti-Semitism at sort of the top of our conversations originates, I would say, in the United States and with an organization that is primarily the sort of provider and purveyor of statistics on anti-Semitic incidents, as they describe them. And that is the Anti-Defamation League, which is a major U.S. political organization, which is also understood in the context of U.S. politics as a Jewish organization. I want to be clear, and I will come back to this, that it is a Jewish organization in the sense that it represents a part of Jewish communal organizations and of Jewish infrastructure. But it's misrepresented as an organization of U.S. Jewry and U.S. Jewish interests, if such a thing even exists. And I want to provide some of the history of how this misunderstanding and this misconception has taken place. The question that I begin with is, why are we always confronted with this set of statistics that says anti-Semitism is on the rise? It appears in the press. It appears in legislation as the reference point for to explain why legislation is needed. And in the context of the United States providing support for Israeli genocide and indeed demanding support for the genocide, the notion that anti-Semitism is at a crisis level, and that it's our obligation as people who care about rights to address it, and that the way that we address it is by sending weapons to the state of Israel, comes from a particular source. So since 2023, the Anti-Defamation League has formally counted protest against the Israeli state, against genocide, and against Zionism as anti-Semitic incidents. Its statistics, which have been provided constantly to the press and to elected officials and to the public, had already been driving that sort of discourse since 2016, at least. I'll come to the way that it started much earlier. In 2016, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism was established. The IRA definition comes from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and the definition that it produced in 2016 was called a working definition, meaning that it wasn't really fully adopted, in fact, by this international body of organizations and state representatives that is charged with sort of guarding Holocaust memory. But rather, the IRA body adopted the idea that there should be a working definition, and then several examples were placed into the definition which were not adopted by the organization, but have been sort of de facto used and propagated as if they actually constitute a definition of anti-Semitism. And that definition, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, includes the idea that it's anti-Semitic to compare Israel's present history of genocide to Nazi history, to discuss Israel, the Israeli state, as a racist endeavor, to discuss colonization as a racist endeavor, etc. And there are several other examples. And of course, those are examples that are highly contested because they prevent us from having a factual and historical conversation about what is happening and what has happened with the colonization of Palestine by Israeli forces, and prior to that, by European forces. But in fact, that discourse that claims that criticizing or opposing Zionism or the Israeli state is racist, or is anti-Semitic rather, comes from the 1970s. And I'm a historian, and my role here is to say that we must understand that when these kinds of ideas arise, that they don't arise out of an abstract notion of rights. They don't arise out of an abstract kind of care, but they are political projects that are closely tied to what's happening in the moment that they arise. And they are produced. They're deliberately produced by organizations and actors in the political sphere. So I want to look at what exactly was happening when those were produced. First, I'll say that the Anti-Defamation League's annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents has almost never been scrutinized. It's almost never been analyzed for, looking at its data to understand, how does this relate to our common understanding of what anti-Semitism is? How was this data gathered? How was it analyzed? That has almost never happened. Until in 2021, the very first investigative reporting was undertaken by a US magazine called Jewish Currents, which is a progressive magazine that sort of critiques Jewish institutional life. And the Jewish Currents investigation found by looking at the incidents, that the Anti-Defamation League was, as I'm going to quote, conflating weighty incidents with trivial ones and encouraging others to do the same. And what it meant by that was, just for example, drawing from that reporting, that, for example, there was something that was recorded as an incident where a kosher food section of a supermarket had non-kosher food placed within it. And that had been sort of conflated with something quite serious and obviously anti-Semitic, like an arson attack against a synagogue. But I think, Chief, I think you might need to mute yourself. But those incidents had been conflated and sort of gathered into a single body and reported as sort of establishing the conditions of a crisis of anti-Semitism. And then when those statistics began to include things like protests on college campuses against the genocide, they began to be reported as a 300% increase in anti-Semitic incidents, a 500% increase. They create a circular effect. They generate real fears among people who are not tuned in to the way that they are produced. And those fears, when I'm constantly told that I am unsafe and that passing by a protest against a genocide makes me unsafe, I begin to feel that as a real fear. And then when I'm asked if I have experienced an anti-Semitic incident or environment, my answer is yes, because I've been told that I have. And then those anti-Semitic, the calculation of anti-Semitic incidents invites the policing of those spaces. In fact, in the United States, the criminalization of protests and the designation of such protest as a threat against the nation itself, meaning it becomes equivalent to terror. So there's this sort of circular effect that not only heightens the definition and the claims of anti-Semitism as an experience, but also continues to elevate the authority of the Anti-Defamation League, because they get to say, well, we have been reporting on this and we are the source of this information and we told you that this needed to be policed. And so it elevates their status as an authoritative source. So sorry, I said that I was going to discuss where this all came from, and I want to do that. The Anti-Defamation League itself was established over 100 years ago. It is sort of presumed in U.S. culture and politics to be an organic institution that comes from U.S. Jewry. And U.S. Jewry is understood to be a sort of a historically marginalized refugee population fleeing the Russian pogroms that Carolyn Karcher described to us, and associated with leftism and sort of socialist resistance or communist resistance to those injustices. But in fact, the Anti-Defamation League's history and the history of the other major Jewish organizations in the United States, the American Jewish Committee, AIPAC, and other sort of major institutions, came from a prior immigration wave. And that immigration wave brought Jews from Central Europe, German Jews, who were closely aligned with capitalism, who participated in sort of the European nationalisms of the time, and whose allegiance was to the state, to the capitalist state, to the United States as a settler colonial project, to the idea that civilizing the land of the United States and conquest of the indigenous was a moral value. Really, truly, I don't normally subscribe to the claim that the West is a Judeo-Christian values-based project, but indeed they saw themselves as very closely aligned, and they saw their Jewishness as closely aligned with the Christian influenced capitalist colonialism of the day. And so when their whole history proceeding from there was actually has been an anti-left and anti-communist history defending capitalism and defending the power of Western states. In fact, that is the reason that they embraced Zionism, not as some Jewish liberation project, but rather as an extension of Western power. The reason I bother to provide that history is because that is the value system that produced the project of counting anti-Semitic incidents. As strange as that may sound, it was not an anti-racist project. It was a project of fueling the power of Western supremacism. And here's how it happened. In the late 1970s, at the time that the United States Israel lobby was really cohering, was really finding its feet, it was closely aligned with neoconservatism. Neoconservatism was a political movement that adopted what were sort of the norms of US liberalism, meaning conversations about rights and democracy, but sought to impose them on the rest of the world in a very Cold War modality. So the idea that capitalism and US leadership was how the world was going to be a moral place and a democracy. And it also saw the civil rights and Black liberation movements at home in the United States as going too far, as extremist. And it included in that the movement against the Vietnam War. It included the movement for gender liberation. It was essentially a sort of traditionalist view of the world that sought to contain those movements at home and also promote capitalism and Western supremacism abroad. And at the time in the United States, the white Jewish population that had previously experienced discrimination was no longer experiencing anti-Semitic marginalization. It was economically and politically empowered and included. But the project of defending Israel required that those organizations be able to make the argument that Israel was like the civil rights movement. And it wasn't, right? It had been rejected by Black organizers. It had been Chief, I think you're echoing again. Sorry. It had been denounced as a colonial project, and maybe the hosts could mute one of the lines there. Thanks, great. It had been denounced as a colonial project, and it was really difficult for the Israel lobby to make the claim that it was a racial liberation project. And so it became necessary, literally necessary, for the Israel lobby to recreate the idea that anti-Semitism was a problem. And it did this in two very concrete ways, among others. One was in 1974, the Anti-Defamation League published a widely disseminated book called The New Anti-Semitism, which redefined anti-Semitism to say that, in fact, now that the US Jewish population was closely connected to the state and to state interests, that in fact these movements, the anti-war movement, the anti-racist movement, etc., were anti-Semitic not because they were opposed to Jews, but because they were challenging the state. And the Anti-Defamation League and the other organizations in these groups claimed that the interests of the state and the interests of Jews were the same. Now, if you ask me, that's an incredibly anti-Semitic statement that they were making. But that was the argument that they made. They made the argument that the entire left, anyone who challenged the state, who challenged the United States dominance in the Cold War, who challenged capitalism, who suggested that the United States was not a moral leader, who opposed the forced imposition of quote unquote democracy, was in fact anti-Semitic. And then the second thing that they did in 1979 was to begin to publish these audits, as they call them, of anti-Semitic incidents. The audits of anti-Semitic incidents simply counted. They were a fairly opaque kind of counting, this happened, that happened. And then between one year and the next, they were able to propose that there was a rise. There was almost always a rise in the number of incidents. Their methodology was, I would say, questionable at best. And one thing that they did that was incredibly important was they stopped local Jewish communities from analyzing what was happening. So, say, for example, there was a synagogue whose windows were broken. The local Jewish community might say, well, who did this? Was it kids? Was it mischief? Were there also windows broken in the school and in the church? If so, maybe this wasn't an attack on Jews. Maybe this was an attack on, traditional institutions.
And Maya, you're frozen.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
All right, I'm gonna turn this on one more time and hope that it doesn't freeze. Okay. Um, so there was an effort by local Jewish communities to understand the nature of what they were experiencing as anti-Semitic incidents, to understand whether it actually threatened them, whether there was a power problem, whether someone had resentments that were not about Jewishness, but about, say, economics or institutions. All of that was wiped away by the Anti-Defamation League's counting of anti-Semitic incidents, converting things into statistics, conflating small incidents with large ones, and pulling the discussion of anti-Semitism out of local communities where it could be understood and analyzed and into a centralized, nationwide narrative whose function was to say Jews are under threat, and here's what that means, constantly year after year. And in addition to pulling that narrative into a sort of centralized national conversation, which then became a foreign policy conversation as well, the Anti-Defamation League brought its other politics into those conversations. So, for example, it would say, here are all of these anti-Semitic incidents that have taken place in the United States. What's really motivating them is Soviet and Arab anti-Semitism, even though there was no discussion, there was no research on any kind of other incidents. There was a conflation of these sort of national incidents of US interest with domestic anti-Semitism. It also happened to take place at a moment where in the United States, the rise of white nationalism and racist violence was causing great concern. There was a great appetite in the press for these kinds of statistics and analysis. And it was also mobilized and sort of adopted by the press and by elected officials because the Anti-Defamation League was a sort of safe and authoritative voice. It was a white organization. It was not a Black liberation organization talking about racism in a way that challenged anybody's, conception of capitalism. It was a safe organization acting in the interest of the state. And so its statistics became so ubiquitous and so felt so necessary to the press that literally no journalist had scrutinized them until this little magazine, Jewish Currents, began to do that in 2021. At this point in the United States, it's pretty widely understood, I think, that the Anti-Defamation League and its counting of anti-Semitic incidents is instrumentalized, is weaponized, and is a project of the right, the political right. Nonetheless, it provides crucial data that media organizations feel they can't live without. The numbers are used in policy proposals all the time as if they have never been questioned. And because there are so many people working within politics and within institutions who actually are interested in pushing right-wing and racist politics, the Anti-Defamation League statistics provide cover that allows them to do it while claiming that they are part of a civil rights project. The last thing that I'll add to this is that in the last 10 or 15 years, the model that was pioneered by the Anti-Defamation League has produced dozens of copycat groups. The anti-Semitism sphere, the anti-Semitism arena. And these are organizations that claim to be opposing anti-Semitism, but in fact are perpetrating anti-Palestinian racism and repression, police repression of all kinds inside the United States as well. They claim to be grassroots, which is an important political platform from which to act in the United States, but in fact, they're often funded by mega donors. And they claim to represent Jews in a way that is obviously that fails on its face, given that something like 67% of US Jewry is now no longer endorsing Zionism or saying that it's central to their Jewishness. So I hope this clarifies how the project of counting anti-Semitic incidents is a inherently and historically conservative, anti-communist, racist, and anti-left political organizing project.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Gelman, for deconstructing the racist and capitalist motivations for the support of Zionism and for explaining the role of the Anti-Defamation League in perpetrating the misleading notion of widespread anti-Semitism. Our final faculty member is Chief Charles Taku. Chief Taku is an international legal practitioner before international courts and tribunals with 4 decades of professional experience, 25 of them in practice before international courts and tribunals, international adjudicatory bodies, international dispute settlement mechanisms, counseling, diplomatic practice, and conflict resolution. He is a cultural leader, a mentor, and a leading crusader for reparations justice for colonial crimes and historic wrongs. Chief Taku is former president of the International Criminal Court Bar Association and a life member of the governing council of the African Bar Association. He has defended cases in the International Criminal Court, the Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the Special Court for Sierra Leone, the African Court for Human and People's Rights, the UN Human Rights Council, and national jurisdictions in Africa and Europe. He recently presented public lectures at the Sierra Leone Law School, Pantheon Law School in Paris, the Africa Development Conference at Harvard Law School, and the Kwame Nkrumah University College of Science and Technology in Kumasi, Ghana. Chief Taku is a traditional chief and is a mentor and advocate for reparations justice for colonial and historical crimes. He was given the International Human Rights Award by the International Women Network of Women for Peace and Democracy in Brussels earlier this year, the Distinguished Service Award by the African Bar Association in 2025, and the U.S. Municipal Guard's Jump Start Veterans Courage Award by U.S. Municipal Guard's Law Enforcement Volunteer Corps in 2013. He is a member of the People's Academy Task Force. Chief Taku will discuss Zionism in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Chief Taku? Chief, we can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this very important session. And let me begin by making 1 or 2 comments. The Westphalian Order that created colonialism in 1884 also talked about the civilizing mission of missionaries. In other words, colonialism that was created in 1884 by the European power, the Westphalian Order, also had on the table a group of people, an ideology of Christianity or missionaries, not Christianity as such, missionaries that were to bring civilization through colonialism to Africa. And with what happened thereafter on the African continent, and today, we see Zionism, or that ideology, those missionaries, the people now mutated into what we call Zionism today. Secondly, we recently heard about white genocide in South Africa and Christian genocide, which led to bombardment of Nigeria, which was a response by the US to all the actions taken by South Africa before the International Court of Justice to litigate the question of genocide in Palestine. And therefore, Zionism had always been one of the weapons of enforcement of colonialism and international crimes on the continent of Africa. But permit me to start by citing Professor Ali Masri in the preface to the book, Africa, the Curse of Berlin. Africa after the Cold War by Adekeyi Adebaju, 2010. Quote, Africa overlaps with the Muslim world and both are affected by the United Nations. But we cannot talk about war and peace under the umbrella of the United Nations without discussing the role of the UN in matters affecting Africa. The conclusion which has already been drawn from experience is that the universalism of states ostensibly achieved by the UN is still a creation of the Western world. Permit me also to draw your attention to the fact that the Jewish people have lived in Africa from time immemorial and peacefully with other African communities without suffering any form of anti-Semitism. Ethiopian Jews, for example, African leaders therefore knew the difference between Zionism as political ideology, violent and hurtful political ideology, and the harm it has caused the continent, and anti-Semitism. African leaders did not in any time in history conflate Jewish identity with Zionism. Where, however, the Organization of African Unity, which was founded on May 25, 1963 in Addis Ababa, and transformed to African Union in 2002 in Durban, South Africa, identified policies of Israel which were driven by Zionist political ideology, such as its support of apartheid, colonialism, and aggression, which are contradictory to the charter of the Organization of African Unity, now African Union. The said policies were clearly identified as coming within policies outlawed by the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the Banjul Charter, which was adopted in 1981. African Charter on Human, the Banjul Charter stated in its preamble, and permit me to quote the relevant part, the African leaders expressed their resolve to achieve total liberation of Africa. The people of which are still struggling for their dignity and genuine independence, aimed at achieving this objective by eliminating colonialism, neo-colonialism, apartheid, Zionism, and aggressive foreign military bases. African leaders pledged to eliminate all forms of discrimination, particularly those based on race, ethnic group, color, sex, language, religion, or political opinions. Zionism fell within this. And Zionism is a form of colonialism, a form of apartheid. and its main weapon of attaining its objective is genocide. African leaders reaffirmed the adherence to the principles of human and people's rights and freedom contained in their declarations, conventions, and other instruments adopted by the Organization of African Unity. Zionism is linked to historical and political context of colonialism and atrocity crimes against Africa, particularly during the Cold War, during apartheid, wars of aggression on the continent of Africa, such as the Six-Day War, such as the Six-Day War against Egypt, and the crimes committed in the occupation of Palestine. These provisions of the African Charter are consistent with Article 3H of the Constitutive Act of the African Union, which pledges to promote and protect human and people's rights in accordance with the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, and which are relevant to international norms. The African Charter is a significant legal framework for the struggle against colonialism. Zionism was included due to its perceived association with colonialism and apartheid. Zionism, apartheid, and colonialism. Apartheid and Zionism are violent and extreme in nature. Apartheid has been used to justify segregation and discrimination. Apartheid is an unauthorized segregationist racial discrimination. It is violent, exclusionary, and oppressive. Zionism is a political movement known for its violent, oppressive, genocidal, and exclusionary policies against Palestinians, Arab minority people of Israel, and in the African continent. African leaders considered apartheid ideology Zionism movement, which is masked in some cases as religion, as launch pads of violent suppression, mass displacement, and deportation of persons. Zionists supported apartheid and Bantu stance in South Africa under the Botha apartheid system. Ronnie Christie, a Jewish South African dissident, who served as Minister of Intelligence in the ANC between 2004 and 2008, declared Zionism as a political system which is premised on Zionist exclusivity. The relationship between Israel and South Africa historically involved a strong political and military alliance during the apartheid era. They had a vital defense industry cooperation and ignored UN-imposed embargo on the supply of arms to the apartheid regime. They shared a nuclear capability cooperation agreement. On attaining majority Black African majority rule under Nelson Mandela, South African nuclear capability disappeared, while that of Israel has remained till date. While the nuclear capability of Libya was taken away, and Muammar Gaddafi was eventually killed. And the African Sahel and Libya bombarded and opened the gateway to terrorism in the Sahel, in West Africa, and in the entire continent of Africa. So, if Israel using the Zionist ideology was supporting, or they were cooperating with South Africa on the nuclear project, they surely also know where the South African nuclear capability has gone to, and also know exactly what has happened to Muammar Gaddafi and the proliferation of terrorism in the Sahel. That is a serious threat to Africa today. Afrikaner apartheid ideologues and descendants sanitize and of late who of late have been sanitized as white genocide survivors by the US and giving a free immigration pass to the US propagated a biblical notion similar to that of Zionists in Palestine, that the land in South Africa was given by God to them when they arrived in the 17th century. The reality is that they used violence, conquest, terror, and bloody wars to occupy and control 70% of the land in South Africa. Similarly, Zionists claim that in the 1940s, Palestine was a land without people, or a people without land. Christian Zionism. During the apartheid regime in South Africa, Israel and the apartheid regime had a shared aversion of a hostile world of dark people. Zionists used racist biblical interpretation to justify their religious belief that Israel is a land of a chosen people elected by God. But this is not the view of a majority of the Jewish people. It is a Christian ideology of Zionists. Zionists use racist biblical interpretation to justify their religious belief, and apartheid had a strong religious element under the African Zionist Christian Church. Christian Zionism influenced political discourse and framed and support for Israel in terms of religious obligation, equating opposition to its extreme fundamental political ideology with anti-Semitism. The big lie conflating Zionism is that Zionist anti-Semitism. The lie equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism is challenged by repeated requests by Israel to obtain observer status in the African Union, despite the African Charter equating Zionism with colonialism, apartheid, and aggressive political ideology, enabling oppression, racism, apartheid, and many forms of discrimination and violence in Africa and against the people of Palestine. Despite the foreign policies of Israel against Palestinians, which Africa vehemently condemned, Israel has not interpreted African opposition to Zionism and its aggressive policies were anti-Semitism. Israel knows best what anti-Semitism is and knows the difference between the position of the African Union and the African Charter and anti-Semitism. Israel has over the last 2 decades, struggled to obtain observer status of the Organization of African Unity and then the African Union. Previously, Israel succeeded in obtaining observer status in the Organization of African Unity in 2002 and lost it because of its discriminatory policies and political aggression against the Palestinian people and its continued support for apartheid and racist policies. Israel made an attempt in 2013 and 2016 and finally succeeded in July 2021 to acquire observer status in the African Union. The observer status was revoked in February 2004. And its delegation, Israel's delegation to the African Union at December, was blocked entry in the meetings of the African Union over the genocide in Gaza. Israel was found not to have fulfilled the criteria for observer status because the war and the genocide in Gaza and the occupied territory of Palestine are contrary to the principles of the African Union and the people of Africa. Is Zionism an expression of self-determination for Israel and the Jewish people? And I ask this question because Zionists present Zionism in Africa as an expression of self-determination for the Jewish people. The African Charter aims to promote human rights and dignity, and the anti-Zionism provisions are seen as part of the struggle against colonialism and oppression. These provisions align with the principle of jus cogens, which are norms considered fundamental to international law and which emphasizes the right of the people to self-determination, including the people, African peoples, and the people of Palestine. The right to self-determination is not a license to commit systematic racial discrimination or systematic violation of international human rights of other people. particularly the rights which are protected by African Charter, by the UN International Human Rights Framework, and particularly the rights of Palestinians and intergenerational victims of apartheid. This violates the International Covenant on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. Zionists, apologists of Zionism, have argued that Zionism is being vilified for leading the struggle of Israel to self-determination. They fail to consider the context in which the African Charter equated Zionism with colonialism and the harm it caused to the right of self-determination in Africa. Since 29th of November 1947, the General Assembly adopted Resolution 181 to partition Palestine and provide a homeland for Israel. And Israel was admitted as a member of UN on the 11th of May 1948. Zionism is against the right of Africa to self-determination. The African Charter was adopted in 1981 during a period when many African nations were grappling with the legacy of colonialism apartheid. The comparison of Zionism to colonialism was made to highlight the struggles against oppression faced by African nations. The characteristic of Zionism in Africa Charter is consistent with international law. UN Resolution 1904 of 20th November 1963 proclaimed UN Declaration of the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. The African Charter on Zionism is consistent with this convention. The Palestinian right of self-determination aligns with the principles Africans fight for the right of self-determination, and Africans stand resolutely with the people of Palestine who are undergoing genocide and also claiming the right to self-determination. International law, including the International Court of Justice, the decision on the war, the partition of the Palestinian war and the war, said that it was a form of apartheid. And contemporary international law and the decisions of the ICJ has characterized the action of Israel as genocide and a form of racial discrimination. I know we're pressed with time, but this subject is extremely very important to Africa. And Africa stands resolutely. Africa has suffered genocide. Africa has suffered racial discrimination. And one of the weapons, one of the tools, enabling tools for genocide, for racial discrimination, has been Israeli policies of support for apartheid and for Zionism. I started by citing the case of white Zionism, or a so-called white genocide, turning the crime of genocide against the men and women and children of Palestine, turning it up on its head by sanitizing the conduct of the descendants of apartheid and characterizing the crimes in South Africa as white genocide, and also trying to make a mockery of Christianity by turning the crimes of Boko Haram, international crimes of genocide in Nigeria and other parts of Africa, and attempts in order to justify the occupation, putting forces in the Gulf of Guinea under the pretext of defending Christian genocide in Nigeria by characterizing a genocide in furtherance to the pressures and the lobbying by Zionists in America and the obliteration of the legal frameworks against racial discrimination against people of African origin and historical crimes shows the continuing harm caused by Zionism and the policy of Zionism on Africa and the violation of the African Charter and the African Constitutional Act. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Chief Taku, for explaining how Zionism is related to apartheid, colonialism, and genocide, and it's explaining its trajectory in Africa and the anti-Zionism provisions in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, and also for detailing how Zionism violates the right to self-determination for Africans and Palestinians. So thank you again for that. In our final section of this program, we are going to have a brief discussion between faculty members, comments on each other's presentations or things that they wanted to add, and then we will open it up to questions from the students. So if any of our faculty members would like to mention anything, raise questions, or make any comments, please do. And if not, we do have a question for Ms. Gilman. How did you verify your statement that the Anti-Defamation League had no research to support its conclusion that anti-Semitism in the 1970s was prompted by Russians and Arabs? That's one of the questions.
I saw it. Hi, Bob. It's good to see you. They literally offered no evidence. It's sort of I'm not sure how to answer the question except to say that they would describe, for example, a swastika written on a wall in Kansas and then say what's really happening is that the PLO is sowing anti-Semitism in the United States. It's like simply unrelated in much the same way that you could sort of imagine. And in fact, it worked also in concert with their other reports, which did sort of research and characterize Arab and Palestinian movements and leftist movements. I say research in quotes. The ADL had a practice of publishing what sort of purported to be investigative reports that were sort of framed in the cloak and dagger, like espionage style of Cold War television shows to say, like, we followed so-and-so and we heard from, so-and-so met with this other person and they discussed nefarious plans. It was, almost silly if it weren't dangerous. And then whenever, particularly in the context of reporting on Arab activities, whenever, for example, a representative of an Arab League nation would say, our issue is not with Jews, our issue is with Zionism, the Anti-Defamation League materials would say, that is a clever trick to make us think that they don't actually hate Jews. Like, there was simply no evidence and an absolute abundance of drawing ridiculous and unsupportable conclusions from evidence that was presented. And I will say that until maybe the mid-1990s, the Anti-Defamation League was fairly widely understood at least within Jewish communities, as a highly conservative institution.
Thank you for that. Are there other questions or comments for our faculty? If not, I would like to raise a couple of points, and one I think that was alluded to, and that is the BDS movement, or the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, which is a nonviolent initiative by Palestinian civil society. It was initiated in 2005 to encourage boycotts and divestments and sanctions against Israel, and particularly the occupied Palestinian territories, but all of Israel as well. And it has had a real economic effect on Israel, because people are always saying, what can we do? What can we do? And of course, lobbying Congress members who are increasingly refusing to take contributions from the Israel lobby, AIPAC, and opposing weapon sales to Israel is growing. But I wanted to mention that just a couple of days ago, in fact, it might have just been a day ago, the United Auto Workers voted to divest from Israel, and with some 400,000 active members across the United States, voted to divest an estimated $400,000 from Israel's bonds. And the UAW was the first major national union to vote to divest from Israel. And along similar but related lines is the trial of the ULM 5, which is a trial going on. It's a trial of 5 pro-Palestinian activists who are charged with belonging to a criminal organization and destroying property of an Israel-based defense firm in Germany's Ulm. Germany has been a long-standing supporter of Israel, and the 5 activists are from the UK, Spain, Ireland, and Germany. They're linked to a group called Palestine Action Germany. They have mainly committed property damage, which many people do not consider violence. And in September of last year, they broke into the Ulm premises of Ulbit Systems, which is one of Israel's largest arms manufacturers. And they're also charged with using symbols of Hamas, which has been labeled a terrorist organization in Germany. The case raises the risk that measures which are actually intended to combat organized crimes in Germany are now being used against political protest. And there was a trial in the UK earlier this month where 4 Palestine Action activists were convicted in the UK of criminal damage. And Palestine Action was also labeled a terrorist group in the UK. One of the activists was also found guilty of inflicting grievous bodily harm. In February, the High Court of the UK ruled that the terrorist group designation was unlawful, and the UK government is appealing. And back to Germany, the Ulm 5 have now been in custody for 8 months. The pro-Palestinian movement is much weaker in Germany than, for example, in Britain or France because of the policies of Germany and its support for Israel. So I just wanted to mention that because people say, what can we do? What can we do about this genocide? What can we do about Israel's continual ethnic cleansing of, moving not from Gaza, because they're continuing to do that in Gaza, but into Lebanon under the guise of self-defense. And this boycott, divestment, sanctions movement is something that I encourage people to examine and possibly participate in, because it has really gained tremendous traction, so much so that Israel considers it to be something of an existential threat. I see we have under the, let's see, my question is, there are suggestions for how to grow the truth in the media. Are there suggestions for how to grow the truth in the media and Congress regarding anti-Zionism not being anti-Semitism? And how can we change U.S. policies towards Israel? There's also a question, to what extent is the increased repression against people who advocate for Palestinian self-determination a result of good decisions from the International Court of Justice that are explicit about Israeli violations of international law? Would any of our faculty like to comment about in response to either of these questions?
I can comment briefly. We feel that the these attacks are in fact testimony to how much ground has been gained by the pro-Palestinian movement. It's because the pro-Palestinian movement has been so successful that attacks against it are becoming more and more draconian, and efforts like labeling them as terrorist groups are a response to their success.
Thank you for that, Professor Karcher. Any other comments from any of our faculty about increased repression against pro-Palestinian voices for Palestinian self-determination? Is that a result of these good decisions in the ICJ, the World Court, which is the judicial arm of the United Nations?
I would tend to agree with Dr. Karcher that that any success produces a backlash of of state repression. So yes, the ICC decisions and also the mass uprising of popular movements, I think perhaps is even more concerning than official actions, because it reflects an erosion of a common sense. And as to the question of how do we shift the representation in the press of the claim that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, I think that there are two problems that we face. One is that the voices of those sort of conservative institutions that are claiming that they're the same are very.
You're frozen, Amaya. You're frozen. You may want to turn off your video again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, sorry. I'll stay off for the moment. The voices of conservative organizations that are peddling those ideas are quite strong, but they are also increasingly discredited in public discourse, in the public sphere. So there is an opening. If some of the reason that their voices are amplified is because their media organizations and politicians want to use them as a rationale for continuing to prosecute state violence, for continuing to make state violence sort of the order of the world and claim that it is in defense of rights. And for when conservative and violent organizations are seeking to deliberately do that, I don't think we can intervene. But I think that there is a way to intervene where journalists have the power to amplify or refuse to amplify those voices, to credit them or refuse to credit them. And so this is one of the few places that I would say that their grassroots power is not doing very much, but journalists have an incredible amount of leverage right now. So if we are looking for places to organize and where to direct our efforts, I suggest actually that not major media organizations, but journalists themselves are an important area for us to organize, an important sector for us to reach.
If I may.
Yes.
Well, I've been thinking about this problem. We must realize now that the Palestinian problem, the Palestinian problem about the genocide is a world problem. It's having a lot of impact worldwide, especially on the African continent. And I started by defining Africa. And when I look at elements of what we call the law of the sea, the Indian Ocean, maritime security across the Indian Ocean right to the Cape of Good Hope, and also in the Gulf of Guinea, and also coming to Europe, to the United States, and also what's happening in neighboring countries, and I have in mind the genocide in Darfur that has been carried by the UN Human Rights as a genocide and African Union, and also the Israeli policies of consistently wanting to member of the African Union. And they know exactly that being a member of African Union is important for themselves, for their own, for international politics and peace. And I suggest that the type of discussion we're having, for example, in the African Union, that the application of Israel is being examined and conditionality is given, that you meet this, that ties their membership observer status to stopping the genocide of the Palestinians, the right of Palestinians to self-determination and the entire sub-region is something that must be encouraged. The unfortunate thing, though, is that the Zionists, and I put this distinction between the Israelis, the people of Israel, the people who are doing the politics of Israel wanted to remember African Union, and the Zionists that have the reach of Zionism is very far and control politics, even first world countries, countries, United States and others. And we'll find people being persecuted merely for criticizing Zionism because they conflate Zionism or anti-Semitism. I'm afraid that, and the court system in these countries is being affected in many ways. And also on the continent, I saw somebody saying free the people who are detained in South Africa, and also for the Ethiopians and Africans detained, the migration policies in South Africa today, and the migration problem, worldwide problem today, which has been politicized. It is everything is started because we neglected Palestine. The way neglected Palestine, they thought Palestine could just be wiped out of the face of the earth. Zionism will have a day, and there will be peace and security in the world. And I think all of us should not give up. This platform, this discussion is very important, and these discussions should take place in many other places, and the proceedings and will implement what we're saying. It is a matter of conscience for the rest of the world, because we need not be Palestinians, but there's a genocide in Darfur. There is the white genocide, so-called white genocide ideology today, refer to this. So Palestine is transformed into all the areas of the world. We are all victims. The free world are victims to the conduct of Zionism.
Thank you so much. We're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank our esteemed faculty, our administrator, the interpreters, as well as the People's Academy Task Force. Our next program will be Stopping U.S. Aggression Against Cuba. It will take place on July 30th, and you will all receive more information soon. Thank you for coming. See you then.
Thank you.
Thank you.